Section 1. The surface layer. What everyone knows. There is a small mountain town somewhere in Colorado. It sits in a valley ringed by pine-covered peaks that hold snow through most of the year, and the sky above it is the kind of deep, cloudless blue that only exists at high altitude. On the surface, it looks like any of 100 quiet little places you might drive through and forget. A gas station, a school, a few streets lined with modest homes, smoke drifting out of chimneys in winter, kids waiting at a bus stop in the cold. But there is nothing quiet about this town, and whatever else you might say about it, you will never forget it. Welcome to South Park, Colorado. Or rather, welcome to a place that is slightly, deliberately, impossibly stranger than anywhere you have ever actually been. Tonight we are going slowly. There is no rush here. The whole point of this journey is to move at the pace of something you are discovering for the first time, turning it over in your hands the way you might turn over an old photograph you found in a drawer, one that you almost recognize, one that keeps revealing new details the longer you look. We are going down through the layers of this show, starting at the top where the light still reaches and descending, step by step, into the parts that most people never see. The iceberg model is a good one for something like South Park. The part above the water is obvious. Almost everyone knows it. 4 boys in a small Colorado mountain town. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. Eric Cartman, the round, parka-wearing sociopath with a gift for manipulation so refined it approaches artistry. Kyle Broflovsky, the moral compass who spends most of his time watching that compass spin uselessly. Stan Marsh, the closest thing the group has to an ordinary human being. And Kenny McCormick, muffled and orange and absolutely indestructible despite dying in a new and creative way almost every week for the better part of 5 seasons. The show premiered on August 13th, 1997 on Comedy Central, which at that point was somewhere between a real cable network and an extended comedy experiment. The pilot episode was called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, and it aired at 10 in the evening and drew roughly 980,000 viewers, which was considered a phenomenon for cable television at the time. Within months, South Park was the fastest-growing show in cable history. Within a year, Comedy Central had gone from reaching 9.1 million households to over 50 million. But the show was not just a hit, it was a cultural detonation. The surface of the iceberg is the stuff everyone knows. The fart jokes, Kenny dying, Cartman's schemes, the guest episodes, the controversies, the parents getting upset, the schools banning the merchandise, the news segments with outraged commentators. If you grew up anywhere near the late 90s and early 2000s, you breathed this in whether you watched the show or not. Cartman and his parka became one of the most immediately recognizable silhouettes in animated television history, right alongside Homer Simpson's profile and Bugs Bunny's ears. That kind of saturation is rare. That kind of staying power is rarer still. But here's the thing about icebergs. The part above the water is never really the interesting part. It is just the part you notice first. The interesting part is the bulk of it, massive and cold and perfectly still in the dark water below, holding up everything you can see with a weight that is almost impossible to imagine from the surface. The show has run for 28 seasons as of 2025. It has produced well over 300 episodes. It has generated a feature film, multiple video games, a Broadway musical that won 9 Tony Awards, a documentary, a restaurant, and an extended universe of streaming specials. The 2 men who created it, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, met in a film class at the University of Colorado in 1992, bonded over Monty Python and a shared instinct for anarchic, anti-authoritarian humor, and have been making things together ever since with a consistency and a creative velocity that is genuinely unusual in the entertainment industry. Shaw Parker was born in Conifer, Colorado in 1969. His father's name was Randy. He worked as a geologist. His mother's name was Sharon. She worked in insurance. If those names sound familiar to you, they should, because Stan Marsh's father, Randy, is a geologist and his mother is also named Sharon. And Randy Parker's actual professional background is woven directly into the fabric of the most frequently recurring adult character in the show's run. That kind of detail is not accidental. Almost nothing in South Park is accidental. And once you start pulling that thread, you find that it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. Before there was a show, there were 2 short films. Both were called The Spirit of Christmas, The first? Made in 1992 on an 8mm camera with actual construction paper and glue, and a budget that was essentially whatever they could scrounge from the university's film department, featured Jesus fighting Frosty the Snowman, while four small children watched and reacted with a volume and vocabulary that would make most adults nervous. It premiered at a student screening, got some laughs, and then went more or less nowhere. The second one was different. In 1995, a Fox broadcasting executive named Brian Graydon paid Parker and Stone $2,000 to make a new version as a video Christmas card to send to friends. The budget was around $750 once they kept their commission, and what they made in those few days on a shoestring was something that changed everything. Jesus versus Santa Claus, the true meaning of Christmas. Four foul-mouthed children in a snowy Colorado town. Kenny getting killed. Kyle established as Jewish. The entire DNA of the show packed into 5 minutes of handmade animation. Graydon sent it to around 80 people. One of those people was reportedly George Clooney. Someone digitized it and put it online. Someone else copied that version. Someone after that copied that copy. This was 1995. Most people did not have email. Broadband internet was a dream for the very wealthy and the very patient. And yet this construction paper Christmas card became one of the first genuinely viral videos in internet history, spreading through early file-sharing networks and bootleg VHS copies, and floppy disks passed around office buildings like something contraband and precious. The show was already a phenomenon before it existed. It was already controversial before it aired. It was already being talked about before anyone outside of a fairly small Hollywood circle had actually seen it. Parker and Stone had not marketed anything. They had not promoted anything. They had just made something strange and funny and genuinely unlike anything else, and then they had let it go, and it had taken on a life of its own in the dark. Comedy Central's executive Doug Herzog saw the short and commissioned them to develop a series. The development process had its own friction immediately. The first focus group that saw the pilot reportedly hated it so comprehensively that their recommendation was to simply discard the whole concept. But Comedy Central's president of programming, Eileen Katz, believed in it, and in one of the more remarkable leaps of faith in television history, she greenlit a show that a test audience had told her was worthless. The animation style, the flat, deliberately cheap-looking cutout aesthetic, was directly inspired by the paper animation that Terry Gilliam made for Monty Python's Flying Circus. Parker and Stone had grown up watching Monty Python, had bonded over Monty Python on their first meeting, and the aesthetic felt like an extension of that tradition. But there was something else the animation did that was not just stylistic. It created a kind of cognitive dissonance, a gap between how the show looked and what it was actually doing that was central to why it worked. It looked like a children's program. The characters were small and round and primary colored. The backgrounds were simple, the movement was limited. And then out of those small, round, simple-looking mouths came things that no children's program had ever come near. The contrast was the point. The pilot episode was originally produced using actual physical construction paper in stop motion. Every episode after that was digital, using software designed to replicate the look. The show has not touched actual paper since its first night, but the aesthetic has remained constant across nearly 3 decades because it still does the same job. It still creates that gap. It still makes you do a double take. It still lets you laugh at things that, in any other visual context, would just be disturbing. The paper cutout style is not just a look. It is a permission structure. By the time the first season's episode called Damien aired, the ratings had climbed to 6.4. South Park was not just the most watched show on Comedy Central. It was one of the most watched shows on any cable network in the country. And the controversy was feeding the ratings, and the ratings were feeding the controversy in a loop that has not stopped turning in nearly 30 years. That is the surface. That is what you can see when you look at South Park from the shore. A funny, crude, controversial animated show that got very popular very fast and never really went away. But beneath the surface, the iceberg extends down into water that is cold and dark and absolutely extraordinary. Let's go deeper. And hey, before we do, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. I genuinely want to know. Whether it is 2 in the morning in your bedroom or a lazy afternoon on your couch, your company on this particular journey means something. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the button is right there. It costs you nothing, and it helps more than you know. Section 2. The hidden architecture, how the show is actually built. Most television shows are made the way buildings are constructed. The foundation goes in first, then the frame, then the walls, the wiring, the plumbing, the finishing work. Each stage builds on the one before it, and the whole process takes a planned and predictable amount of time. You start in pre-production months before anything shoots. You develop scripts, you run them through rewrites, you test them, you shoot them, you edit them, you color correct them, you deliver them to the network weeks or sometimes months before they air. South Park is not made that way. South Park is made the way a jazz musician improvises. The structure is there. The key is established, but the actual notes are found in real time, and the whole thing depends on a level of instinct and velocity that most creative processes simply cannot sustain. Since the fourth season, which began airing in the year 2000, South Park episodes have been written, voiced, animated, and delivered to Comedy Central in approximately 6 days. 6 days from the blank page to the finished product. The 2011 documentary, 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford, who would later make the Casa Bonita renovation documentary, follows the production of a single episode from concept to broadcast. And what it shows is something that should not work, but absolutely does. Trey Parker pacing a writer's room at 2 in the morning. Voice recording sessions happening while animation is still being finalized. And the crew pulling overnighters that stretch from night into the following morning into the following afternoon. The finished episode being transmitted to the East Coast sometimes, just hours before it airs on the East Coast. This is not a production schedule. This is a controlled emergency that repeats itself every week for most of the year. And it is deliberate. Parker has talked extensively about why this is the way the show works, and his explanation reveals something important about the philosophy behind everything South Park does. He has said that the fear of not being funny is worse than the fear of being offensive. In the writer's room, the driving anxiety is not, will this upset someone? It is, will this be any good? The show is not engineered around the question of what it can get away with. It is engineered around the question of what will make the people in that room laugh at 2 o'clock in the morning when they are exhausted and the deadline is coming. The offensive parts are, in a real sense, a byproduct. The targets get chosen because they are funny to Parker and Stone, and because they represent something that the show genuinely has something to say about. But the process starts with whether the joke works, not with whether the joke will provoke a reaction. This distinction matters enormously, and it is one that people who only know South Park by reputation often miss entirely. The 6-day production schedule also means that the show functions less like a traditional animated series and more like a live news program with jokes. When something happens on a Monday, it can be in an episode that airs by Wednesday. But when the NBA had its China controversy in October 2019, South Park aired an episode directly addressing it in the same week. When Steve Irwin died in September 2006, he appeared in a South Park episode less than 8 weeks later. When the 2016 election returned, a result that Parker and Stone had not anticipated, they rewrote the following week's episode entirely overnight. This responsiveness is the thing that keeps the show feeling alive after 28 seasons. Most shows that age have a certain embalmed quality. They have been doing the same things for so long that the rhythms are deeply familiar, the characters' responses are predictable, and the feeling of genuine surprise has faded. South Park still surprises because it still operates at the speed of surprise. It is responding to a world that is still changing, and it is doing so in real time, which means the responses are sometimes brilliant and sometimes poorly considered, and occasionally just wrong, but they are never stale. The writing process itself is unusual in another way. Parker functions as the primary writer and director on most episodes, with Stone taking more of a producing role. The two men have been collaborators for over 30 years and have developed a shorthand that allows them to build stories very quickly. But Parker carries a particular creative weight that few other showrunners in television history have sustained for this long. He does the majority of the voice work. He does the majority of the writing. He directs essentially every episode. The creative vision of South Park is, in a real sense, a single mind working at full speed under constant pressure, which gives the show a consistency and an idiosyncrasy that are both deeply unusual. The animation is done in Autodesk Maya, software designed to replicate the paper cutout look of the original handmade shorts. The characters are built from simple geometric shapes, deliberately limiting their range of motion and expression to preserve the aesthetic that Parker and Stone established in 1992. The town itself, the layout of South Park, the placement of the school and the houses in Stark's Pond and the surrounding mountains was developed over the first few seasons and has remained largely consistent ever since. It is a fictional town that has become as geographically real in the minds of its audience as many actual places. There is a level of craft buried beneath the apparent crudeness that is easy to miss on first viewing. The music, Yell, for instance, is almost entirely composed and performed by Parker himself, who studied at Berklee College of Music before transferring to the University of Colorado and whose musical instincts run through the show like a hidden current. The songs are not afterthoughts or parody placeholders. Many of them are genuinely well-constructed pieces of music that happen to contain extremely rude content. Blame Canada, the song from the 1999 film that received an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song, is a good example. Structurally, it is a competent Broadway-style number, the kind of thing that would work perfectly well in a legitimate musical if you changed the lyrics. Which is, in a sense, exactly what happened with The Book of Mormon, the Tony Award-winning Broadway show that Parker and Stone opened in 2011, and a decade after they had been making professionally structured songs for South Park. The show's editing rhythm is also worth paying attention to. South Park episodes move at a pace that is quite different from most other animated comedies. The cuts are quick, the jokes build fast. There is very little of the kind of extended comedic padding that shows like Family Guy sometimes employ. This tightness is partly a function of the production schedule. There is simply no time for excess. And partly a reflection of Parker's instincts as a filmmaker, which tend toward efficiency. He has talked about how the crude animation actually helps the comedy because the simplicity of the visual environment forces the writing to carry the weight. When there are no elaborate backgrounds to look at, no fluid character animation to admire, nothing to distract the eye, the words and the ideas have to do everything, which means the words and ideas have to be genuinely good. The show also has a structural tendency toward what you might call the thesis episode. Many South Park episodes are built around a single idea or a single question that the story circles around for 22 minutes and then answers, usually in Kyle's closing speech or in some moment of comedic revelation that doubles as a genuine point. This structure has been in place since the very first season and gives the show a philosophical coherence that is easy to miss when you are laughing at the fart jokes on the surface. Beneath every toilet joke is, more often than not, an argument. Behind every outrage is, more often than not, a position. The show is not just funny, it is persistently making a case for something, even when that something is just the basic principle that nobody should take themselves too seriously. This is why the show has lasted, not because of the controversy, though the controversy certainly helps, not because of the celebrity parodies or the topical humor or the cultural saturation, but because underneath all of that, there is a genuine creative intelligence that has found a way to stay honest and stay sharp across more than a quarter century. That is extraordinarily rare. And most people who watch the show for the first time never think about the architecture holding it all up. They just know that it makes them laugh, or makes them think, or makes them uncomfortable in a productive way, and they come back the following week. That is architecture doing its job. Now, there is one more piece of the show's hidden architecture worth dwelling on, and it is the one that almost nobody outside of the production ever thinks about. The voice work. Parker and Stone do the vast majority of the voices themselves. Parker voices Stan, Cartman, Randy Marsh, Mr. Garrison, Mr. Mackey, Timmy, and dozens of recurring and one-off characters. Stone voices Kyle, Kenny, Butters, Jimmy, and an equally large roster of supporting roles. This is not simply a matter of cost efficiency, though it certainly helps on a show that has a tight production timeline and a relatively compact crew. It is a creative choice with profound implications for the show's texture and cohesion. When Parker voices both Stan and Cartman in the same scene, he is performing both sides of a relationship that he understands in his bones, because he built both sides. The rhythms of their arguments, the way each character's voice sits in physical space relative to the other, the tiny differences in breathing and pacing that communicate character even when the lines themselves are neutral. All of this comes from a single imagination, understanding what both sides of the conversation feel like from the inside. The same is true of Stone with Kyle and Kenny and Butters. The voices carry the weight of being understood from the inside, not performed from the outside. This is different from most animated shows, which use dedicated voice actors who develop their characters over time, but who are always, in some sense, inhabiting a character that someone else built. Parker and Stone are inhabiting themselves, different versions and extensions of themselves, and the result is a kind of intimacy in the performance that comes through even in a show this stylized and this deliberately crude. The Kenny voice deserves particular attention. Kenny speaks in a muffled mumble because of his parka hood, and Stone performs this muffled version throughout the show's run. The audience understands what Kenny is saying, or rather, it projects understanding onto the mumble, inferring content from context. But the actual words are technically unintelligible. This has always functioned partly as a joke and partly as a production choice that allows the character to react and participate in scenes without the writing having to fully account for his dialogue. But it also does something more interesting, which is that it creates a character whose inner life is permanent subtext. You never quite know what Kenny is thinking. You never quite know what he is feeling in any direct or unambiguous way. He is legible through his reactions, through his presence, through what happens around him, but not through his words. He is the most present and the most hidden of the four boys simultaneously. When Kenny becomes Mysterion and speaks clearly, the contrast is startling. The voice is still Stone's, but it is clean and direct and carries weight. Mysterion says things that are genuinely felt, and after years of muffled presence, the clarity lands harder than it would on any other character. The architecture of the voice, the years of indirection that preceded it, is doing work in those scenes. The production also makes unusually sophisticated use of silence. In the episodes that deal with subjects the show takes seriously, the 9/11 aftermath, the Columbine connection, specific moments of grief or loss or genuine moral weight, the comedy pacing changes. The quick cuts slow down, the jokes thin out or disappear entirely. The show breathes differently. Most people who watch South Park casually do not notice this because the changes are subtle and the show rarely abandons its comedic tone entirely. But the pacing is doing work underneath the jokes, and if you watch with attention to when the show is moving fast and when it is moving slow, you find that the rhythm is always intentional and always meaningful. That is the hidden architecture of South Park. Not just the production schedule and the animation and the writing structure, but the voices and the silence and the pace and the way the whole machine has been calibrated over 28 years of continuous operation to do something very specific and very difficult, to make you laugh and make you feel and make you think, in that order, and to do all three at the same time when it is working at its best. Section 3. The characters are real people. The personal stories beneath the fiction. One of the things that gives South Park its particular texture, that quality of being slightly more real than other cartoons, even while being absolutely more absurd, is that the characters are not invented wholesale from nothing. They are grown from actual soil. They are made out of real places, real people, real memories, real heartbreaks, and real obsessions. Understanding where the characters come from changes how you watch the show, because suddenly the performances feel warmer. The jokes hit differently, and the emotional weight that occasionally shows up in the middle of all the absurdity makes complete sense. Start with Stan Marsh. Stan is, in almost every verifiable sense, Trey Parker. They share a birthday, October 19th. They share a family structure. Stan's father is named Randy, his mother is named Sharon, his sister is named Shelley. Trey Parker's father's name was Randy, and he worked as a geologist. Stan's dad, Randy, is also a geologist, at least at the beginning of the show, before Randy's character evolved into something far larger and stranger and more anarchic. Trey's mother was named Sharon. His sister was named Shelley. The alignment is complete. But when Stan reacts to the world around him with a mixture of moral seriousness and barely contained frustration, that is Parker working through something recognizable. And when Randy Marsh became one of the breakout characters of the show's later seasons, doing increasingly unhinged things in increasingly elaborate ways, that development was driven partly by Parker's genuine affection for a character who, in his most basic form, was his own father. Kyle Broflovsky is Matt Stone with about the same degree of precision. Stone's parents are named Gerald and Sheila. Kyle's parents are named Gerald and Sheila. Stone describes himself as ethnically Jewish. His mother is Jewish, which makes him Jewish by matrilineal tradition, though he is himself an atheist. Kyle is the Jewish kid in the group, the one who carries a particular kind of earnest moral seriousness, and who is frequently defined by his relationship with that identity. The Broflovsky family name is a fairly direct nod to Stone's own heritage. When Kyle argues passionately and futilely for what is right in a world that has gone sideways, that is Stone. When Kyle gets disproportionately angry about Cartman's particular brand of bigotry, that is Stone working through something real. Cartman is harder to trace to a single source because Cartman is, in some ways, a composite of every horrible instinct that Parker and Stone have ever observed in anyone, including themselves. He is the id of the show, the character who does what the rest of us suppress, who says the unsayable thing without hesitation, and who pursues his own desires with a complete and utter absence of moral constraint. Parker has described Cartman as the most fun character to write because the only rule is that there are no rules. Cartman can do anything. He can go anywhere. The show can follow him into darkness that would be completely unworkable with any of the other characters, because Cartman's darkness is so thoroughly established and so comprehensively explored that it functions as a kind of black hole around which the rest of the show orbits. But there are real roots even here. Leanne Cartman, Eric's mother, is named after Trey Parker's real former fiancée. The two were engaged while Parker was at the University of Colorado, and the relationship ended badly and painfully. Parker named a character in Cannibal the Musical, and the feature film he made while still at school, after her, specifically a disloyal horse. And then he named Eric Cartman's mother after her too, making this real woman the basis for what became one of television's most memorably permissive and strange parental figures. This kind of channeling of personal pain into creative material is a running thread in Parker's work. But the Leanne detail is one of the most specific and most raw of the instances. Kenny McCormick is named after a real person. The real Kenny was a childhood friend of Parker's growing up in Colorado. He was the poorest kid in the neighborhood, wore a thick parka because his family could not afford better winter clothing, and had a habit of missing school frequently enough that his classmates occasionally wondered aloud if he had died. Now, the joke about Kenny dying over and over, which became one of the show's most iconic recurring gags, was born from that childhood memory of a kid who kept disappearing and reappearing. The real Kenny, as far as is publicly known, is alive and well and has presumably had mixed feelings about being the inspiration for television's most repeatedly murdered animated child. Butterscotch is based on Eric Stowe, the show's longtime animation director and a close friend of Parker and Stone's, who has worked on the program essentially since its beginning. Stowe's nickname in the production office was Butters, derived from a shortening of Little Buddy, and his gentle, eager-to-please nature made him the perfect template for what became one of the show's most beloved characters. Butters is, in the South Park universe, has something close to a pure soul. He is perpetually optimistic, despite being perpetually victimized by Cartman in ways that would break a less constitutionally cheerful person. He is trusting in a world that consistently betrays that trust. And he keeps coming back, keeps trying, keeps believing that the next time will be different. The real Stowe, by all accounts, finds this affectionate rather than cruel, which says something good about him. Even Randy Marsh's geological background is autobiographical. Parker grew up watching his father work as a geologist, and the early seasons of the show play Randy's expertise for humor in ways that are clearly drawn from a real familiarity with what geologists actually do. when Randy evolved into something more sprawling and more bizarre. The recreational marijuana farmer. The man beat up at a baseball game. The Lord impersonating internet troll. The geological background remained embedded in his character, a foundation note beneath all the layers of absurdity. The town of South Park itself is rooted in a real geographic location. The South Park Basin is an actual high-altitude valley in central Colorado, roughly an hour's drive from Denver, ringed by the Rockies and sitting at an elevation of about 9,000 feet. Parker grew up in Conifer, not far from this area. Stone grew up in Littleton, in the Denver suburbs. The mountains, the specific quality of the light, the character of the winters, the particular kind of small-town Colorado life that forms the background of the show, all of this is drawn from direct experience. When the show depicts a snowstorm shutting down the town, or the boys playing in Stark's Pond, or the mountains looming over everything in the background, it is depicting something that Parker and Stone actually know and have walked through and remember. The character of Mr. Garrison, the boys' perpetually troubled and perpetually inappropriate teacher, has evolved more dramatically than perhaps any other character in the show's history. In the early seasons, he was a closeted gay man, in denial about his own sexuality in ways that made him simultaneously sympathetic and troubling. Over time, he transitioned, detransitioned, became a parody of Donald Trump during the 2016 election and after, and mutated through so many identities that he became a kind of funhouse mirror for everything the show wanted to say about identity politics and the instability of self-conception. But in his earliest form, Garrison was drawn from the observation of real people who use hostility and projection as armor against truths they cannot yet face. That specificity, the sense that this is based on something real and human and recognizable, is what makes him funny rather than merely offensive. Chef, the school cafeteria cook voiced by Isaac Hayes, was one of the most warmly drawn characters in the show's history, and his story has a genuinely painful real-world dimension that we will come back to later in this journey. But his creation was rooted in a specific affection for the archetype of the wise, warm, slightly inappropriate adult who serves as a counterweight to the chaos of the boys' world. Hayes brought something to the performance that no amount of writing could fully explain. A genuine musicality, a warmth, a sense of belonging in the character's skin that made Chef feel real in a way that even the best cartoon characters sometimes don't manage. Understanding that the characters come from real places, real people, real emotional experiences, changes the way you watch the show. It means that behind every joke, even the most outrageous, there is a specific person who found something genuinely funny about a specific real thing. It means the show's tenderness, when it shows up, and it does show up more than you might expect, is rooted in real tenderness. And it means that the darkness, which the show explores with more honesty than almost any comparable work, is drawn from the same well that everything else is drawn from. The darkness is not a pose, it is not provocation for its own sake. What it is Parker and Stone being honest about the parts of human nature that most entertainment politely declines to acknowledge. And that honesty, more than any specific joke or any specific controversy, is the foundation of everything the show has ever built. Section 4. Kenny's Death Lore. The Cthulhu Connection and the Immortality. Rabbit hole, close your eyes for a moment and picture a child in an orange parka. The hood is pulled tight, you cannot see his face. He mumbles when he speaks and no one around him seems to quite make out the words, though they respond as if they do. He is the poorest of the four boys, the one who lives on the roughest street, whose parents are always on the edge of something bad. And every week, for the first 5 seasons of the show, he dies. Hit by a car, crushed by something falling, devoured by something impossible, struck by lightning or disease or cosmic accident. He dies and someone in the group says something is wrong, and then he is simply gone, and then the following week he is back, standing at the bus stop again. Orange parka drawn tight as if nothing happened. No one mentions it. No one wonders about it. The deaths simply pile up like deposits in a geological record, and life in South Park continues. The original joke was simple. Kenny died in almost every episode. The other boys reacted, and then he was fine the next week. No explanation was given and none was sought. It was a running gag in the most literal sense. A single beat repeated in infinite variation. And for the first several seasons, it worked, because the cause of death changed every time, and because the reactions of Stan and Kyle and Cartman, particularly Cartman, who sometimes seemed almost gleeful about the whole thing, were always slightly different. The joke was about the casualness of mortality in a world where everything is absurd. But then something changed. In Season 5, Episode 13, called Kenny Dies, the running gag was abandoned. Kenny was diagnosed with a real disease, muscular dystrophy, and he died for real, and the episode played it seriously in a way that was genuinely affecting. Parker and Stone had gotten bored of the death joke and decided to end it with something that had actual weight. Kenny stayed dead through essentially all of Season 6. On a storyline involving a character called Butters as the temporary fourth friend, and later a character called Tweak, occupied the space Kenny usually filled. And then, in the Season 6 finale, Red Sleigh Down, Kenny returned. No explanation. His friends saw him and said something like, "Oh hey Kenny," and that was that. His immortality had become a fact of the show's universe without anyone ever explaining what it meant. The explanation, when it finally came, was one of the deepest and strangest pieces of lore the show ever produced. And it arrived not as a single revelation, but as a slowly assembled picture spread across multiple episodes in Season 14, centered on a three-part arc involving Kenny's superhero alter ego, Mysterion. Here is what you need to understand about Mysterion. In Season 13, watch the boys create superhero identities for themselves. Cartman becomes the Coon, a hero defined almost entirely by his own self-regard. Kenny becomes Mysterion, a figure in a dark hood and cape who is genuinely mysterious. Not performed mysterious, actually mysterious, because Mysterion has a power that none of the other costumed kids have. Mysterion cannot die, or rather he can die, but he comes back. And unlike Kenny's deaths, which happen in the background of normal episodes and are forgotten by the next week, Mysterion knows about his own deaths. He remembers them, he carries them, and he does not understand what he is. In Season 14's three-part arc, Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends, the pieces come together. The story involves Cartman teaming up with Cthulhu, the cosmic horror entity from HP. While Lovecraft's fiction, a being of such incomprehensible scale that its mere existence drives ordinary humans to madness. Cartman, being Cartman, is not driven to madness. He is delighted. He rides Cthulhu like a pet. He uses the ancient deity to banish Justin Bieber and his fans, to destroy whole cities, to generally conduct the kind of vendor-scale devastation that only Cartman would think to direct at the things that personally annoy him. But the arc also reveals, through Mysterion's investigation of his own origins, the reason for Kenny's immortality. Kenny's parents, it turns out, used to attend meetings of a cult of Cthulhu. They were not believers. They went for the free alcohol. But attending those meetings established a connection between Kenny and the cosmic entity. As a connection that manifested as a specific and terrible gift, Kenny cannot permanently die. Every time he is killed, his mother gives birth to him again. He grows back to the same age at a rate that is never precisely explained. And the people around him, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, everyone in South Park, have their memories of his death wiped, which is why no one ever remarks on his constant dying. The amnesia appears to be part of the same cosmic mechanism. It is built into the architecture of Kenny's curse. But Cartman is an exception. There are a handful of episodes across the show's run in which Cartman demonstrates awareness that Kenny dies repeatedly. The most often cited instances include a Season 2 episode called it City on the Edge of Forever, in which Cartman is the only one who remembers Kenny dying, and a Season 6 episode called Cartman Land, in which Cartman says offhandedly that Kenny dies all the time. The fan community noticed this and began asking why, and a theory emerged that explains it in a way that fits the show's own internal logic with remarkable precision. In Season 3, an episode called Succubus involves Cartman needing an eye transplant. The donor for his new eyes is Kenny's frozen head, which happens to be available. Cartman receives Kenny's eyes. From that point forward, there is a consistent case that Cartman has been seeing through Kenny's perspective in some partial way, which gives him awareness of things that the other boys cannot see, including the continuous cycling of Kenny's deaths and rebirths. Kenny's eyes, Cartman's awareness. It fits. It is never confirmed on screen, but it fits with what the show shows us. And the South Park fandom has found it so satisfying that it has essentially become accepted as canonical by the audience even without official acknowledgement. There is another layer to this that is worth dwelling on. When Kenny speaks as Mysterian, when he drops the muffled mumble and speaks in a clear voice in the superhero context, he talks about his curse with a weariness and a genuine sorrow that is quite different from the comedic tone of his normal deaths. He says that he wakes up every morning in his same old clothes, that he has been here before, that he cannot make it stop. At one point, he tries to convince Cthulhu to kill him because only an immortal can kill another immortal. And for a moment, it seems like the arc might end with Kenny finally, genuinely dead. It does not. Cthulhu and the supernatural threat are defeated by a different character entirely, and Kenny remains trapped in his loop. There is something genuinely melancholy about this, and it is the kind of melancholy that South Park occasionally lets surface through the comedy in a way that lands harder because of the contrast. Kenny's immortality sounds like a superpower. In practice, it is closer to a sentence. He lives and dies and lives again, and the people he loves forget him every time, and he wakes up the next morning wearing the same clothes in the same poverty, in the same town with no memory of his own deaths, but a deep, inexplicable sense of having been here before. An infinite number of times in the same orange parka, waiting at the same bus stop, watching the same mountains hold the same snow. That is the Cthulhu mythology buried inside what most people just thought was a joke about a kid who keeps dying in funny ways. That is what the iceberg looks like a few levels down, and it gets stranger still. Cthulhu itself, in Lovecraft's original mythology, speaks in a kind of low, muffled rumble, a cosmic voice that human beings can barely perceive and cannot properly understand. In South Park, Kenny always speaks in exactly that way. A muffled voice, barely perceptible words, language that the people around him technically respond to but never quite comprehend. The parallel is specific enough that it is almost certainly intentional. It's a tiny structural joke buried so deep in the show's architecture that it functions less like a reference and more like a watermark, something that only becomes visible when you hold the thing up to the light at exactly the right angle. Section 5. The aliens are everywhere. The hidden visitors and the show's secret language. Let's slow down here, let's breathe for a moment and settle into something quieter. Outside, wherever you are, the world is doing its thing. Cars passing on a street somewhere in the distance. Wind against a window. The particular quality of silence that comes late at night when the ambient sounds drop away and you become aware of the hum underneath everything. Inside the South Park universe, right now, in the background of a scene you are probably not paying attention to, there is an alien. These are called the Visitors, and they are one of the show's longest-running and most deliberately obscured running gags. They first appeared in the pilot episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, which was specifically about alien abduction, so their presence there was not subtle. But Parker and Stone decided early on that they wanted to continue including the aliens in subsequent episodes in a way that was emphatically not obvious. Not as plot elements, not as characters, just as background details, hidden in the scenery, placed in each episode by the animation team like a secret handshake between the show and its most attentive viewers. The decision to hide them rather than feature them came from a specific concern Parker and Stone had about how the show would be perceived. They originally wanted aliens to appear more prominently throughout the series, but they became worried that frequent alien appearances would make South Park look like it was parodying The X-Files, which was enormously popular at the time. So they kept the aliens but made them invisible. They are there in almost every episode if you know where to look. In trees, in crowd scenes, driving vehicles in the background, reflected in glass, carved into furniture, shaped into everyday objects. The alien design is consistent. They are the classic gray alien, the kind that has become a cultural shorthand for extraterrestrial life through decades of science fiction. Long-limbed, large-headed, dark-eyed. That they blend into backgrounds with a particular ease because they are placed with genuine care by an animation team that has been playing this game since the show's first season. There is an entire dedicated community of fans who catalog every visitor appearance in every episode, tracking them the way dedicated viewers track blink and you miss it references in much more self-consciously Easter egg-laden properties. The South Park visitor catalog runs into the hundreds. Some episodes have multiple appearances. Some are placed in such genuinely difficult spots, blended into a wall pattern, incorporated into a crowd in a single frame, rendered in a slightly different style to make them harder to identify, that they have gone unnoticed for years before someone with freeze-frame patience finally found them. This is a show that has been hiding the same running joke in every episode for nearly 30 years, and the joke is not designed to be caught. It is designed to exist whether or not it is noticed, a layer of meaning operating entirely below the level of ordinary viewership. The hidden visitor tradition connects to something broader about the show's relationship with its own internal language. South Park has developed, over its long run, a set of recurring visual and structural jokes that function almost like a private code between the show and its most dedicated audience. The aliens are the most elaborate of these, but they are not the only one. Cheesy Poofs, the fictional snack brand that Cartman is addicted to, appears in the background of episodes with a regularity that turns it into a kind of environmental constant and a piece of South Park's material culture that has been there long enough to feel as real as the mountains. Casa Bonita, the actual Colorado restaurant that Parker and Stone loved as children and that features in a Season 7 episode as the setting for one of Cartman's more elaborate schemes, appears in the background of various South Park shots years before and after the dedicated episode, a detail that rewards the kind of watching where you notice things on the periphery of the scene. The town of South Park has a consistent geography. Stark's Pond, the school, the general store, the various houses, and violations of that geography for comedic effect are always intentional, never accidental. The show's use of music is also a kind of secret language. Parker composes most of the show's music himself, and the choices are almost always meaningful in ways that go beyond the immediate scene. Songs are repurposed across episodes. Motifs recur. A piece of music from an early season will appear briefly in a much later episode in a different context. And if you recognize it, the recognition tells you something about the relationship between the two episodes. A thematic echo, a callback, a suggestion that the show is aware of its own history and is commenting on it. The credits are another layer. In the Scientology episode, Trapped in the Closet, every single person in the credits is listed as either John Smith or Jane Smith. This was not for legal reasons primarily, though that was a factor. It was a creative decision, a middle finger to Scientology's litigious history delivered in the exact space where names usually go. The credits became the joke. The same episode where Tom Cruise literally locks himself in a closet and is begged to come out also contains, in its credits list, the most explicit possible announcement that everyone involved was treating the whole thing as a joke about the church's history of targeting critics with lawsuits. There is the question of the show's internal timeline, which is deliberately paradoxical. The boys are in the 4th grade. They have been in the 4th grade for nearly 30 years of real time. They do not age. Events happen, stories unfold, the world changes around them, but the boys remain 9 years old. This is not unusual for animated shows. The Simpsons operates the same way. The characters perpetually frozen at the ages they were in 1989. But South Park has occasionally acknowledged the strangeness of this directly, in moments of meta-awareness where a character will reference the fact that something happened years ago in what is supposed to be the same school year, or where the absurdity of the children's age becomes part of the joke. One fan theory that has circulated for years suggests that Kyle is the only character who is genuinely aware of the temporal impossibility of their situation, that he alone, among the 4 boys, knows that something is wrong with the time, that they should be adults by now, that the 4th grade has lasted too long. There are a handful of moments across the show's run that could support this reading, though the show has never confirmed it. It remains a theory. But it is the kind of theory that the show's architecture makes possible, the kind of idea that grows naturally from paying very close attention to something that most people do not look at hard enough. The show also has a recurring relationship with its own pilot episode that is worth noting. The pilot is the only episode animated using real physical construction paper. Every subsequent episode has been digital. But the pilot's visual aesthetic, slightly rougher, slightly more tactile, with a warmth that the digital animation technically reproduces but cannot quite replicate, becomes a kind of North Star that the show returns to symbolically when it wants to remind you of where it came from. The construction paper origin is mentioned repeatedly across the show's history. Parker and Stone treat it as the show's foundational text, the thing that contains all the essential DNA in its most compressed form. Even the alien on the construction paper pilot episode is placed with care. It appears in a specific scene in a specific part of the frame, in what was genuinely just construction paper and glue and an 8mm camera. Someone put it there by hand. Someone cut out a tiny paper alien and glued it to the background of a shot that lasted less than a second. This is the earliest known instance of the visitor tradition, and the fact that it exists at all, in the very first thing they ever made before the show was a show, before there was any audience to notice, tells you something important about what Parker and Stone were actually doing. They were building a world, not just telling jokes, but building a world that had hidden depths and private meanings and secret jokes that existed whether anyone found them or not. They were making something that rewarded attention, that gave more to the people who looked harder, that had a life running below the surface of what was plainly visible. That is the visitor tradition. That is the show's secret language. That is the iceberg teaching you how to look. Section 6. When South Park predicted the future, let your breathing slow down a little here. There is something almost meditative about this particular section, because what we are going to talk about is the strange and slightly unsettling pattern that emerges when you look at South Park's history against the history of the world it was commenting on. The pattern is this. South Park, with a regularity that exceeds mere coincidence, it has depicted things that subsequently came true. Not always, not with perfect accuracy, but with enough frequency and enough specificity that it raises genuine questions about what exactly Parker and Stone are doing when they sit down in the writer's room and start building episodes. Start with Jared Fogle. In Season 6, airing in March 2002, South Park aired an episode called Jared Has AIDS. Fogle was, at this point, simply the Subway spokesman, the man who had lost an enormous amount of weight eating Subway sandwiches and who appeared in advertising campaigns as a relatable, approachable symbol of healthy change. The episode featured a version of Fogle and a running joke about giving AIDS to children, which in the context of 2002 was simply an absurdist word game, a play on a word that sounded like another word. The episode aired. The joke landed as the kind of dumb wordplay South Park often used, and then the show moved on. 12 years later, in 2015, Jared Fogle was arrested and convicted on charges of child sexual abuse. And suddenly, the old episode's joke about giving AIDS to children felt less like a wordplay pun and more like something that had reached through time to find its own meaning. The show did not know. Fogle's crimes were apparently unknown to anyone outside his immediate circle in 2002. But the retroactive resonance is genuine and documented, and it is one of the most cited examples of South Park's uncanny relationship with the future. The climate change arc is a different kind of prediction, and one that Parker and Stone have been unusually honest about. In 2006, South Park aired Man Bear Pig, in which Al Gore is depicted as an attention-seeking fool who keeps warning about a non-existent creature as a metaphor for climate change. The episode's position was clear. Climate change concern was being overblown, Gore was being dramatic, and the whole thing was a manufactured panic. This was not well received by climate scientists and environmentalists at the time, but it was absolutely the position Parker and Stone held. And then, 12 years later, they made 2 new episodes called Time to Get Cereal and Nobody Got Cereal, in which Man Bear Pig returns and turns out to be devastatingly real. And the boys apologize to Al Gore for not believing him. Gore, being Gore, accepts the apology in the most obnoxious way possible because this is South Park, and nothing is allowed to be simply redemptive. But the correction was genuine. The Parker and Stone used the show's own characters to admit, on screen, in narrative terms, that they had been wrong. This is almost vanishingly rare in any creative medium. The Washington Redskins team name controversy was addressed by South Park in Season 4's Chef Goes Nanners in 2000. 14 years before it became a dominant news story. The episode put the town of South Park through a debate about changing a racist flag, with Chef arguing for change and other characters arguing for tradition. The actual Washington Redskins changed their name to the Washington Commanders in 2020, and the Cleveland Indians changed their name to the Cleveland Guardians the same year. 2 decades before those changes happened, South Park had worked through exactly that debate. AI being used by movie studios to generate ideas was a joke in Season 8's Awesemo, in which Cartman disguises himself as a robot and a Hollywood studio wants to use him to generate film ideas. This aired in 2004. Warner Brothers announced plans to develop an AI system for evaluating box office potential and assisting with creative development nearly 2 decades later, making a throwaway science fiction gag into a piece of prescient technology commentary. Colorado legalizing recreational marijuana was depicted in Season 14 in 2010, 2 years before Colorado actually passed Amendment 64, making it legal in 2012. The episode called Medicinal Fried Chicken was specifically about the state legalizing medical marijuana, but the broader direction was clear, and the real-world timeline followed remarkably close behind the fictional one. Up to the Carnival Cruise Line being associated with terrible toilet situations was the subject of a passing news story in a 2010 South Park episode. In early 2013, the real Carnival cruise ship called the Triumph suffered a fire that disabled its engines and toilets, stranding over 3,000 passengers for 4 days in what became universally known as the Poop Cruise, one of the most comprehensively unpleasant maritime non-disasters in recent history. The show had described Carnival cruises as smelling like poop precisely 3 years before. KFC running out of chicken in its UK branches was depicted as a crisis in a 2010 episode. In February 2018, KFC in the United Kingdom had to close up to 700 of its approximately 900 locations because a change in delivery suppliers had caused a massive chicken supply failure. The show had invented the same scenario 8 years earlier, the AI art discourse, specifically the idea of AI being used in creative industries in ways that displaced human workers and raised questions about authenticity and ownership, was explored in multiple South Park episodes before the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike made those exact questions the center of mainstream cultural debate. Sexual harassment in the workplace becoming a major social and legal flashpoint was satirized in Season 3's Sexual Harassment Panda, in which the boys learn about inappropriate behavior and then immediately start filing lawsuits against everyone. This aired in 1999, 8 years before the conversations that eventually led to the cultural shifts of the 2010s. Drone warfare and civilian drone use becoming entangled in ways that raised civil liberties concerns was depicted in Season 18's The Magic Bush. This was 2014. The regulatory battles over civilian drone use and the philosophical questions about domestic drone surveillance became mainstream conversations later in that decade. What this pattern suggests, when you look at it all together, is not that Parker and Stone have some mysterious predictive gift. What it suggests is that they are watching the world with unusual precision, identifying the fault lines and absurdities in current events and social trends at a moment when those fault lines are just beginning to show, and then dramatizing them in a way that makes the underlying dynamics clear. They are not predicting the future, whilst they are reading the present more carefully than most people bother to, and the future keeps proving them right because they have done their reading homework. This is ultimately what good satire always does. It does not invent new absurdities. It identifies existing ones and holds them up in a light where they become impossible to ignore. The predictions feel supernatural because we are used to ignoring what they are paying attention to. When reality catches up, it feels like prophecy. But it was always just careful looking. There is also the matter of social media and internet culture, which South Park began anatomizing before most people understood it as a distinct cultural force. The Season 19 and 20 arcs about PC culture, trolling, and the mechanism of online outrage were written at a moment when these dynamics were accelerating, but had not yet reached the saturation level they would achieve by the late 2000s and 10s. The depiction of social media as a kind of ambient psychic pressure that warps behavior, that creates performance incentives where none existed before, that makes everyone into a kind of public figure subject to public accountability for their most private impulses. All of this was in South Park years before the cultural conversation caught up. The member berries from Season 20 deserve particular attention as a predictive element. They are small, sentient, berry-like creatures who talk in tiny voices and say things like, "Member the Empire Strikes Back," and "Member when things were simpler," while inducing a kind of nostalgic intoxication in anyone who eats them. They are, in the show's allegory, the mechanism through which nostalgia-driven politics operates. Not through reasoned argument, but through emotional comfort, through the feeling of returning to a time when things were better, even though that time may not have actually been better. The member berries were Parker and Stone's diagnosis of the nostalgia politics behind both the Brexit campaign and the 2016 Trump campaign, both of which were happening in real time as season 20 was being written. The diagnosis was accurate. The nostalgia as political tool dynamic they identified has only become more central to political discourse in the years since. Freemium games and the psychology of mobile gambling were the subject of a 2014 episode, Freemium Isn't Free, which depicted the mechanics of in-app purchases and the way they exploit compulsion in ways that are structurally similar to gambling addiction, and which introduced a literal devil as the character behind the freemium business model. This was 2014. Regulatory conversations about loot boxes, in-app purchases, and the ethics of compulsion mechanics in games for children became mainstream news several years later and continue to this day. The episode had already made the argument in its characteristic way years before the regulatory apparatus caught up. On the internet as an overwhelming and addictive presence that destroys attention spans and meaningful social connection was the subject of multiple episodes across several seasons. But the season 14 episode You Have Zero Friends anatomized the specific psychology of Facebook, the social anxiety it generated, the way it converted authentic relationships into quantified metrics, the feeling of obligation and performance it imposed on users, with a precision that was ahead of where the mainstream cultural conversation about social media was at the time. This was 2010. The years that followed would provide extensive evidence for everything the episode had argued. What you find if you go back through the full record is not a show with a mystical predictive gift, but a show that has consistently done the work of understanding the world it operates in. Parker and Stone read widely, pay attention obsessively, and trust the principle that if something is absurd enough to be funny, it is probably true enough to be worth saying. The things that seem prescient in retrospect were, when they were written, the obvious next step of something already happening. South Park just followed the logic to where it led, without the social inhibitions that typically prevent that kind of following through. That is the real secret behind the predictions. Not prophecy, just honesty about where things were obviously going, delivered with enough irreverence to slip past the defenses that usually stop that kind of honesty from landing. Section 7. The Imagination Land Saga. The episode arc that was almost a movie. There is a place where all the things ever imagined live. Every creature from every story, every character from every film, every being that has ever existed in the mind of a human being, and then been given a form to inhabit. They are all there, living in an ordered world divided between those who came from good stories and those who came from dark ones, separated by a barrier that holds the evil side away from the good one. It is a place where Aslan walks alongside Morpheus and Wonder Woman and Gandalf and Luke Skywalker, where the Council of Nine governs the heroic imaginary population, where the woodland critters from the South Park episode of the same name lurk on the wrong side of the barrier and cause the kind of trouble that even imaginary creatures should probably not be allowed to cause. This is Imagination Land, and it was almost the second South Park movie. The Imagination Land trilogy aired in October 2007 as episodes 10, 11, and 12 of season 11. Parker decided partway through the week before the first episode aired that what he had originally conceived as a single episode needed to be 3. He has described sitting down on the Thursday morning after the first episode had already been broadcast and working out the complete structure of the remaining 2 episodes on a whiteboard. Every beat, every turn, every piece of the story, in a single session that he called one of the best writing days of his career. The whole thing came together in a few hours on a Thursday morning for 2 episodes that were being animated even as they were being written. The story begins with Cartman dragging the boys through a forest to look for a leprechaun that he insists he saw. Kyle makes a bet that leprechauns are not real. The leprechaun is real. Kyle owes Cartman something that the show describes with characteristic directness. A leprechaun, it turns out, was sent to warn of an impending terrorist attack, not on any real-world location, but on Imagination Land itself. The boys are transported there via a machine built by a strange man who guards the portal, and they arrive just in time to witness an attack. The barrier falls. The evil characters break through into the good side. Butters, perpetually gentle, but perpetually victimized Butters, is left behind when the boys escape, and it falls to him to serve as the key to saving everything. Meanwhile, Cartman, entirely unmoved by any of this, spends all 3 episodes pursuing Kyle across the country, and eventually to the Pentagon, because a bet is a bet, and Cartman has never in his life let a matter of personal satisfaction be displaced by something as abstract as an apocalypse. The scope of the trilogy was genuinely unusual for South Park. The show had done 2-part episodes before, but never 3 parts, and never with this degree of visual ambition. While the animation expanded to incorporate dozens of recognizable fictional characters, rendered in the South Park style but still immediately identifiable, in a way that required planning and production time that the normal 6-day schedule could not accommodate. The Imagination Land arc began production almost 3 months before it aired, an extraordinary lead time for a show that otherwise lives in the permanent present tense. Parker and Stone briefly discussed turning it into a theatrical film. The first South Park movie, bigger, longer, and uncut, had been both a creative triumph and a production nightmare, and their relationship with Paramount Pictures had been strained by the experience. But the Imagination Land concept excited them enough that they considered a second theatrical release. The concept ultimately did not survive contact with the practical realities of theatrical film production, particularly the difficulty of licensing the dozens of copyrighted fictional characters who populate Imagination Land. A scene in the trilogy where the woodland critters encounter licensed characters could work on television, where fair use considerations and the speed of production create a particular kind of creative latitude. A theatrical film is a different beast entirely, legally, and commercially. So, Imagination Land remained a television trilogy, then became a director's cut released direct-to-video in 2008 that reinserted previously unreleased footage and gave the whole thing the feature film feeling it had always been reaching for. The trilogy won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program for Programming. 1 hour or more in 2008, which was a separate category from the regular Animated Program Award, and one that the show had never been nominated for before. It was a recognition that what Parker and Stone had made was genuinely different in scale and ambition from regular South Park episodes, that it operated at a level that required its own classification. At the center of the trilogy is Butters, and this matters enormously. Butters is not, by any normal calculation, the kind of character you would build a 3-part epic around. He is the butt of jokes. He is the victim. He is the naive, gentle, perpetually put-upon soul who gets tricked and betrayed and grounded by parents who seem to genuinely not understand how good he is. And yet, in Imagination Land, Butters is the chosen one. Aslan, the great lion from the Chronicles of Narnia, given an authoritative voice and a gravity that the South Park visual style does not typically accommodate, tells Butters that he is the key, that his imagination is extraordinary, that only he can recreate what has been destroyed and save the world that exists inside the collective human imagination. Butters struggles. He tries to recreate Santa Claus and produces something wrong and frightening. He tries to imagine the fallen heroes back into existence and cannot quite get there. But at the end, after the nuclear bomb has detonated inside Imagination Land and there is nothing left but Butters standing in an empty white void, he closes his eyes, and he tries one final time, and he gets it right. The whole world comes back. Every character, every creature, every story. All of it restored. The moment is played with a gentleness that is not typical of South Park, and it lands because of everything that has been established about Butters in the years before this episode. He is the character who always tries. He is the character who keeps believing even when every reasonable thing suggests he should not. He is the character whose innocence the show has repeatedly used as a target for its darkest jokes, and who has never been diminished by that targeting. When Butters saves Imagination Land, the joke is not on him. For once, fully and completely, the joke is on everyone who ever underestimated him. Kyle's speech in the second part of the trilogy, where he argues before the Pentagon that fictional characters can matter as much as real ones, that Luke Skywalker and Superman and Jesus Christ have had more genuine impact on the way people live their lives than most actual human beings, is one of the most earnest things South Park has ever produced. It is surrounded by absurdity, as all earnest things in the South Park universe must be, but the argument itself is real and it is made well. Parker and Stone believe this. They believe that imagination is not a lesser category of reality, that the things we make up have weight and consequence, that a well-told story changes people in ways, i.e., that facts alone cannot manage. The Imagination Land trilogy is their most sustained argument for their own work. It is a three-part essay on why any of this matters, made from the inside of the animated universe that is making the argument. The ending, in which Butters wakes up and tells his parents about his incredible dream, only for his parents to tell him that it was not a dream, and then immediately ground him for missing his chores while he was saving all of human imagination, is one of the finest comedic beats in the show's history. Because, of course, that is how it ends. Because Butters is Butters and South Park is South Park, and even saving Imagination Land does not get you out of a grounding in a household run by Steven and Linda Stotch. That combination, epic consequence, mundane punishment, is the whole show in one scene. Extraordinary things happen to ordinary people and the world absorbs them without much fuss, and everyone is back to their regular problems by the following week. Now, that is life in South Park, Colorado. That is the show's deepest realism dressed in its most baroque fantasy. Before we leave the Imagination Land trilogy, it is worth pausing on one more detail. The Council of Nine, the governing body of the good side of Imagination Land, consisting of Aslan, Gandalf, Glinda, Luke Skywalker, Morpheus, Popeye, Wonder Woman, Jesus, and Zeus, is a list that reveals something about what Parker and Stone genuinely believe heroism looks like across all of human storytelling. The nine are chosen without hierarchy between high and low culture. Popeye sits beside Gandalf. Zeus sits beside Jesus. The sailor who eats spinach has as much claim on the heroic imagination as the Son of God, because both have given real people something that changed how they understood what it is possible to be. That is a genuine philosophical position about the nature of narrative, delivered inside a cartoon about whether one child has to perform an act for another child in exchange for losing a bet. The philosophy is in the joke. The joke is in the philosophy. You cannot separate them without destroying both. The trilogy was also the creative experiment that eventually led to South Park's serialization experiments in seasons 19 and 20. Parker has said that making the three-part arc gave him and Stone a taste for longer-form storytelling, for the satisfaction of plot elements that paid off across multiple episodes rather than within 22 minutes. The ambition was real, even if the execution of the later serialized seasons was uneven. Imagination Land planted a seed that grew into a period of genuine structural risk-taking that changed the show's form in ways still visible in its most recent seasons. Section 8. Casa Bonita and the Real Colorado, the world that built the show. There is a restaurant on West Colfax Avenue in Lakewood, Colorado, a Denver suburb, that has been there since 1974. From the outside, it looks like a castle. It is pink. It is large. It sits in the middle of a strip mall with the kind of confident architectural extravagance that says, whatever is happening in the strip mall around me is completely irrelevant to my purposes. Inside, it is 52,000 square feet of something that cannot be easily classified. There are waterfalls. There are cliff divers who perform from a 30-foot waterfall into a pool. There are mariachis. There are caves. And there are puppet theaters and arcades, and a Western outlaw named Black Bart, and, famously, a man in a gorilla suit who wanders the premises with no explanation offered or apparently required. The food for most of its history was considered notably mediocre. The experience was considered extraordinary. This is Casa Bonita, and it is real. And understanding why it matters to Trey Parker and Matt Stone tells you something important about the beating heart of the show they made. Parker grew up making birthday deals with his classmates. He would invite them to his Casa Bonita birthday party if they would invite him to theirs. The restaurant was the destination, the prize, the thing that made any birthday worth attending. Stone grew up in Littleton, a Denver suburb, and remembers the whole soccer team being taken to Casa Bonita at the end of a season as a celebration. These are real memories of a real place that had real emotional weight for two kids growing up in Colorado in the 1970s and 80s. And when those kids became the creators of South Park, the restaurant came with them. The season 7 episode, simply called Tat Casa Bonita, which aired in 2003, is built around Cartman's obsession with the restaurant. Kyle is having a birthday party at Casa Bonita. He has invited his 3 friends, but not Cartman, who has been excluded from Kyle's birthday for reasons that are entirely consistent with everything Cartman has ever done. Cartman's response is to convince Butters that a meteor is on its way to destroy the Earth, that the apocalypse is coming, and that Butters needs to take shelter in a bomb shelter immediately for his own safety. With Butters safely underground and out of the way, Cartman takes his place at the birthday party. The town launches a massive search for the missing Butters. The police get involved. Multiple emergency alerts go out. Cartman goes to Casa Bonita and eats sopapillas and watches cliff divers and gets his photo taken and sits in Black Bart's cave and generally has the time of his life while the town tears itself apart looking for a child he knows is perfectly safe in a bomb shelter with enough food and supplies to survive for months. When Butters is found and Cartman is exposed, the police are about to arrest him at the exact moment he is discovered. He makes a run for it. He pelts through the restaurant, past the cliff divers, past the mariachis, past all the attractions he loves, and leaps from the waterfall platform into the pool below. When the police pull him out and ask if it was worth it, all of it, the deception, the arrest, the charges he is certainly facing, Cartman, floating on his back in the pool, looking up at the ceiling of this improbable restaurant in a Colorado strip mall, says, "Totally." Parker and Stone actually went to the real Casa Bonita to get permission to feature it in the episode. The restaurant, touched by the affection in the script, agreed. They even set aside a specific table that became known as the South Park table, the table at which Cartman sits in the episode, and which remained a fixture in the restaurant for years afterward. The story of how Parker and Stone came to own Casa Bonita is one of the stranger chapters in an already very strange career. The restaurant filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in April 2021. When Parker heard about this, the news hit him like something had gone wrong with the structure of the world. Casa Bonita closing would be more than a business failure. It would be the disappearance of something real and meaningful from the map of his own life. He and Stone, who had just signed a reported $935 million deal with Viacom CBS, reached an agreement to purchase the restaurant for $3.1 million in September 2021. They then spent roughly $40 million renovating it, a figure that started at around $10 million and quadrupled as inspections revealed the depth of the problems. Foundational rot, outdated systems, decades of deferred maintenance pressed into the walls like sediment. The renovation is documented in a 2024 film called Casa Bonita Mi Amor, directed by Arthur Bradford, the same filmmaker who made 6 Days to Air. It shows Parker, in particular, becoming increasingly obsessed with getting every detail exactly right. The food, the atmosphere, the cliff divers, the gorilla. He and Stone flew to Oaxaca so Parker could absorb the atmosphere of authentic Mexican culture and bring something real back to a restaurant that had always been a fantasy of Mexican culture but had never been connected to the actual thing. They hired chef Dana Rodriguez, who has received multiple James Beard Award nominations, to rebuild the menu from the ground up. When someone asked Stone whether buying Casa Bonita was a good business decision, yet he said, "Only people as rich and silly as Trey and I would do this. This is an indulgence." Parker laughing, "On paper, it's a very, very bad idea." The restaurant reopened in June 2023. The food is now considered genuinely good. The cliff divers are still there. The man in the gorilla suit still wanders. There is a statue of Cartman, because of course there is, and a man-bear-pig character for meet and greets, and the voices of Trey Parker and Matt Stone come out of animated characters positioned throughout the space. The South Park table is still there. What does this have to do with the show's Iceberg? Everything. It tells you that the people making South Park are not doing it from a position of ironic detachment, looking down at Colorado and small-town American life from a safe comedic distance. They are doing it from inside. While Parker grew up going to this restaurant, the memories are real. The affection is real. The show's relationship with Colorado, its geography, its weather, its particular culture of outdoors adjacent, politically complicated, economically diverse Western life, is not a backdrop. It is a subject. It is the soil everything grows in. When Randy Marsh does something deranged in the mountains, when the boys skate on Stark's Pond in winter, when the altitude and the cold and the particular quality of Colorado spring are depicted in the background of a scene that is nominally about something completely different. All of that is coming from somewhere real. All of that is memory. South Park is, underneath everything else, a love letter to a specific place written in the strangest possible language, sent to people who will mostly not recognize what they are being shown. Section 9. The Censored Depths. What you were never supposed to see, soften your breathing now. Let the weight of wherever you are sink you a little deeper into comfort. What we are going into in this section is colder water. This is the part of the iceberg where the temperature drops and the light starts to fade, and the things living down here are adapted to conditions that most things cannot survive. The story of what was censored, what was hidden, what was changed against the creator's wishes, and what was quietly removed from the world is one of the most revealing stories the show has to tell. Because what gets censored tells you exactly what frightens people. And what frightens people in relation to South Park is a more complicated and interesting subject than it might initially appear. The first self-censorship happened in Season 1, Episode 5. An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig aired on September 10, 1997, less than a month after the show's premiere. There was a subplot involving Stan's sister, Shelley, repeatedly setting Stan on fire and then dousing him with water before setting him on fire again. Comedy Central pulled this scene after the initial broadcast because they were concerned about the kind of blowback that Beavis and Butthead had received for similar content. On the original DVD releases, you can still see a puddle of water under Stan in one scene. The ghost of the deleted moment, present as an absence. The Blu-ray releases removed even this detail. The first piece of creative content Parker and Stone made for broadcast television was edited by the network in the first month the show was on air. The commentary tracks for Season 1 tell a similar story. Parker and Stone recorded audio commentaries for every episode of the first season, intended for the DVD release. Comedy Central refused to include them because the commentary itself violated the network's standards. Parker and Stone refused to allow the commentary to be edited. The standoff resulted in the commentary tracks being released on a separate CD, entirely disconnected from the DVDs. The behind-the-scenes content about one of the most controversial shows on television was itself too controversial for the network's official release. The Trapped in the Closet episode from 2005 is one of the most documented cases of corporate pressure affecting what South Park aired. The episode, in which Tom Cruise literally locks himself in a closet and is begged to come out, while the actual beliefs of Scientology are presented on screen with a caption reading, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," was brilliant, devastating, and enormously popular. It was scheduled for a rebroadcast in March 2006. Comedy Central pulled it at the last minute and replaced it with a rerun from Season 2. The official explanation was that it was a tribute to Isaac Hayes, who had announced his departure from the show 2 days earlier. Multiple media outlets reported that Tom Cruise had threatened to boycott the promotional tour for Mission Impossible 3, which was distributed by Paramount, which is owned by Viacom, which also owns Comedy Central, unless the episode was pulled. Cruise's representatives denied this. The timing was what the timing was. The Muhammad episodes are the deepest of the censored layers, and the ones that carry the most weight. In 2006's Cartoon Wars two-parter, South Park depicted Comedy Central's own refusal to show Muhammad by putting up a black screen in the episode that said, "Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network." This was the fiction, acknowledging the reality in real time, the show becoming the thing it was satirizing, the medium collapsing into the message in a way that almost never happens in television. The show was allowed to include this acknowledgement. It was not allowed to include the actual image. Then came episodes 200 and 201, which aired in April and May of 2010. These celebrated the show's 200th episode with a storyline in which every celebrity ever mocked on the show returned to file a class action lawsuit. Tom Cruise at the center of it. The only resolution was bringing Muhammad, whose apparent superpower is the ability to never be ridiculed, to Cruise so he could take it. Muhammad appeared throughout episode 200, always obscured, behind a black censored bar, inside a U-Haul truck, inside a bear costume, never directly shown. After episode 200 aired, a website called revolutionmuslim.com posted a warning that Parker and Stone risked being murdered. The post included a photograph of the murdered Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, who had been stabbed and shot to death in Amsterdam in 2004 for making a film about the treatment of women in Islam. It included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices. It described what would likely happen if they continued. The New York City Police Department increased security. The FBI opened an investigation, and Comedy Central, without consulting Parker and Stone, made sweeping changes to episode 201. Every mention of Muhammad's name was bleeped. Entire sequences of dialogue were removed. Most significantly, Kyle's closing speech, a speech about how violence and threats should never be used to suppress speech, how the moment you give in to that kind of coercion, you lose something that cannot be recovered, was almost entirely censored. The speech that was censored was specifically a speech about the dangers of censorship. Comedy Central censored a speech about censorship, and in doing so, they proved, with their own institutional actions, that the speech was correct. Parker and Stone posted a statement on South Park Studios saying the network had inserted additional bleeps without their permission, that what aired was not the episode they made. The episode was pulled from Comedy Central's website. It was removed from streaming platforms. Super Best Friends, the 2001 episode in which Muhammad had appeared as a superhero without any controversy whatsoever, was retroactively pulled because it depicted Muhammad, even though it had aired for 9 years without incident. The world had changed around the episode, and the episode became dangerous simply by continuing to exist. The commentary tracks for episodes 200 and 201 are some of the most extraordinary minutes of audio South Park has ever produced. Parker opens the commentary by saying, essentially, that they made the episode as they intended and submitted it. Then a long bleep covers everything he says for several seconds. Stone says, yeah, that's about it. They never say Muhammad's name. They refer to him only as the prophet of the Muslim faith. The commentary that was supposed to explain a landmark episode of television exists instead as a document of the thing that was done to that episode. The censored commentary about the censored episode. A kind of double silence where the voice used to be. The man who posted the threats, Zachary Chesser, was arrested in July 2010. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Not primarily for the South Park threats, but for attempting to provide material support to a Somali terrorist organization. But the South Park controversy was a detail in a pattern of radicalization that had much larger consequences. Parker later said in interviews that the period was genuinely frightening. Not abstract frightening. Physically frightening in a way that meant security details and changed routines, and a sustained awareness that someone meant what they had written. Two people whose whole working lives had been organized around the principle that fear should never dictate what you say were, for a few weeks, navigating the question of their own physical safety in a new and immediate way. And they went back to work. They made more episodes. They continued. That is the part of the story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The censored content, the pulled episodes, now the bleeps and the removed commentary and the missing seasons, all of it is now in 2025 more accessible than it used to be. Streaming has changed things. Fan archives have changed things. But there are still episodes that are not on any official platform. There are still moments that exist only in unofficial recordings and memory. The Iceberg has a layer that is simply not accessible through any channel that Parker and Stone fully control, because it was taken from them before they could protect it. Section 10. The deeper layers. What the show actually believes. We are deep now. Really deep. The surface is a long way up, and the light has been gone for a while. Down here, it is just the weight of the water and the things that are true regardless of whether anyone is looking at them. What does South Park actually believe? So not what it jokes about, not what it has been condemned for, not what it predicts or satirizes or parodies. What, underneath all of that, does the show consistently hold to be true? This is not a simple question, and Parker and Stone have complicated their own answer over the years by evolving and changing their positions as the world has evolved and changed around them. But there are some things that have remained constant across 28 seasons, and these constants tell you more about the show's real character than any individual episode or any individual controversy. The first constant is that no one deserves automatic respect because of who or what they are. Respect is earned by what you do and how you think, not by your status or your institution or your belief system. This applies everywhere. To religions, which South Park has satirized with a comprehensiveness that covers essentially every major faith tradition practiced by significant numbers of people. To governments, which the show has depicted as bumbling and self-interested at best and genuinely dangerous at worst. To celebrities who are treated as people first and icons second or not at all. To corporations, which the show has gone after with a persistence and a specificity that suggests real conviction rather than mere contrarianism. To political movements, to ideological camps, to the entire apparatus of social authority. Nobody gets a pass. The premise of the show is that the world is run by fallible, self-interested, often confused human beings, and treating any of them with automatic deference is a kind of intellectual failure. The second constant is that children, and specifically children's honesty, is the standard against which adult hypocrisy is measured. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny live in a world populated by adults who are almost invariably doing something dishonest, something self-serving, something that they would be embarrassed to have described accurately. The children see through it. Not always. Not perfectly. Not without their own errors and selfishness and cruelty. But they see through it more often than not. And the contrast between what the adults claim to believe and what they actually do is the engine that drives most of the show's satire. Children in the South Park universe are closer to the truth than adults because they have not yet learned the sophisticated social arts of self-deception and performance. They have not yet learned to lie convincingly to themselves, which means they have not yet learned to be fully domesticated by the systems around them. The third constant is the one that has generated the most controversy and the most complexity, and it is this. Thinking for yourself is not just preferable to thinking in groups, it is essentially the only ethical option. Every time South Park attacks political correctness, it is making this argument. Every time it attacks religious fundamentalism, it is making this argument. Every time it shows a crowd of people doing something stupid because everyone around them is doing it, it is making this argument. The show is allergic to mobs of any political orientation, of any cultural affiliation. The moment a position becomes a chant that people repeat without examining, South Park finds something problematic in it, regardless of whether the content of the chant is reasonable. This is where the show has been most critiqued, and most fairly critiqued. Because equal opportunity skepticism is not the same thing as ideological neutrality. In a world where some positions are supported by evidence and others are not, treating all positions with equal suspicion is itself a kind of position. When South Park spent 12 years suggesting that climate concern was paranoid, that was not neutral. That was wrong, and they eventually said so. When the show created a kind of ambient cultural permission to dismiss passionate advocacy of any kind as evidence of groupthink, that had real effects on how some viewers engaged with actual political problems. The show acknowledged this complexity, not always gracefully, but genuinely, and it adjusted. And the later seasons are more willing to acknowledge that some things matter more than others, that some mobs have better reasons than others, that equal opportunity mockery can function as cover for specific and harmful positions if you are not careful about it. The fourth constant is the hardest one to articulate, but it might be the most important. Parker and Stone believe in comedy as a moral technology. Not just as entertainment, not just as satire, but as a way of doing something that other modes of communication cannot do. Of reaching through people's defenses and making them feel something true that they have been successfully avoiding feeling. The fart jokes are not the opposite of the philosophy. They are part of it. The shock value is not a delivery mechanism for the ideas. The shock value and the ideas are the same thing. Inseparable, mutually constitutive. You could not have one without the other and have the same show. When Parker has talked about why South Park has lasted, he comes back to this. The crude animation, the stupid jokes, the offensive content. All of it exists because it creates a specific kind of permission that more respectable vehicles do not have. You go to a lecture and you are on guard. You go to a documentary and you are engaged but defended. You watch a cartoon made of construction paper where a child gets killed by a cow again, and you let your guard down, and in the moment your guard is down, something real can get through. The things that have gotten through across 28 seasons and over 300 episodes form a genuine record. The case for gay rights made through Big Gay Al in 1997, before that case was culturally comfortable to make. The argument against the war in Iraq made through the allegory of the South Park movie in 1999, before the Iraq War had happened, but at a moment when the cultural conditions for it were already being assembled. The acknowledgement that climate change is real, the documentation of how Scientology operates, the exposure of how Hollywood self-censors for the Chinese market, the exposure of how the Mormon Church's founding mythology sounds to someone hearing it for the first time, paired with a genuine acknowledgement of the human value of what that community has built. These are not trivial contributions to public understanding. These are real things that the show did that other things did not do. And it did them by being crude enough that people were not defending themselves when the argument arrived. The show has been wrong. It has been hurtful. It has made jokes that landed in ways that caused real pain to real people who did not deserve it. The Irwin family's grief was real. The Chinese citizens who lost access to a show they loved suffered a real consequence of real courage on Parker and Stone's part. Some of the show's racial humor has aged the way racial humor from any era ages, which is not always well. The sexual assault metaphor in the China Problem episode went further than any satirical point required. But the accounting, done honestly and completely, reveals something that is genuinely unusual. A show this long, this productive, this willing to take real risks, with this few permanent errors and this many permanent contributions to the cultural record, that is rare. That is the kind of rarity that only happens when the people making the thing are working from conviction rather than calculation, from genuine curiosity rather than manufactured provocation, from a real engagement with the world rather than a performance of engagement. Two men from Colorado. They met in a film class. They bonded over Monty Python and made a short film about Jesus fighting Frosty the Snowman with construction paper and glue. One of them named a character after the woman who broke his heart. The other named a family after his own parents. They hired friends to do the voices. They gave themselves 6 days to make something that would air to millions of people. They did this for 28 years. They bought a restaurant because it mattered to them as children. They spent $40 million making it right. They sat in front of the White House's official condemnation of their work and said, "We're terribly sorry," and did not mean a word of it, and went back to work. That is South Park. That is what it is when you reach the bottom of the iceberg and find the thing that all the ice is made of. Section 11. The bottom of the iceberg. The final layer. The water is very still here, very dark. The kind of dark that is not frightening because it is so complete and so total that there is nothing left to be afraid of. Just the weight and the quiet and the sense of everything above you, all those layers, all those stories, all that ice pressing down. At the very bottom of the South Park iceberg is something simple, almost embarrassingly simple given how much architecture sits on top of it. It is this: two people genuinely love making each other laugh, and they have never stopped. And everything else is downstream of that. Parker and Stone met in 1992. They are both in their mid-50s now. They have been creative partners for over 30 years, which by any reasonable measure makes their collaboration one of the longest and most sustained in the history of American entertainment. They have become extraordinarily wealthy. They have become famous in a specific and peculiar way that comes from never quite being visible as people. Most South Park fans know the show but would not recognize its creators on the street. They have been threatened and condemned and celebrated and ignored and celebrated again. They own a restaurant. Now, they wrote a Broadway musical that ran for years. They have a $1 billion company, and in the middle of all of that, the thing that has never changed is the thing that started in a university film class in 1992. They make each other laugh. Parker writes a joke, and Stone tells him whether it works. Stone raises a concern, and Parker finds the version of the joke that addresses it. They argue, they agree, they disagree, they make something that they find funny, and then they send it out into the world, and the world responds in whatever way the world responds, and then they start again. The show is, at its most fundamental, a comedy made by two friends for each other. The audience is the beneficiary of that friendship. The controversies are the side effect of that friendship's unwillingness to police itself. But the longevity is the result of that friendship remaining generative and honest across 3 decades. When you watch South Park, what you are watching is the record of that friendship. Every episode is a letter from it. Every joke is a small proof that it is still alive, still working, still finding new things funny, still refusing to pretend that the world is less absurd than it is. There is something beautiful about that, not despite the crudeness, not in spite of the darkness, but including all of it, the whole thing, the fart jokes and the thesis statements, the censored episodes and the prophecies, the hidden aliens and the immortal child, the construction paper and the White House condemnation, all of it, beautiful. The iceberg goes deep, and at the very bottom where the rock is, yeah, now, it is just two people from Colorado who love making things and love making each other laugh, and who have never, not once in 30-plus years, let the size of the world convince them to stop. Let that thought carry you. Let the weight of all those layers above you press gently down. The mountains are there, holding the snow, and the small town is there in the valley, and the boys are at the bus stop in the cold, waiting for something to happen. Something always happens. And somewhere in the background, if you know where to look, there is a small gray alien watching. Epilogue. The surface again. Coming back up now. Slowly. The way you resurface from a deep pool, not breaking the water but rising through it, watching the light grow from a pale shimmer to something warmer and fuller as you approach the top. Wow, we started with 4 construction paper children in a snowy Colorado valley. We end there too, because that is where the show lives. And that is where it will always live, no matter how many seasons pass, or how many billion-dollar deals get signed, or how many official condemnations arrive from powerful institutions that have other things to worry about. The show has been wrong. It has been right. It has been hurtful and healing. It has been prophetic and foolish. It has been censored and liberated and banned and beloved and probably, somewhere right now, being watched by someone who has never seen it before and is about to have their sense of what television can do permanently altered. 28 seasons, more than 300 episodes, 6 banned, 1 Academy Award nomination, 9 Tony Awards, 5 Primetime Emmys, on a $1.5 billion deal in 2025. 1 White House condemnation, 2 mock apologies, neither sincere, an infinite number of hidden aliens, 1 immortal child in an orange parka, 1 restaurant with indoor cliff divers and a man in a gorilla suit, 1 construction paper Christmas card that became one of the first viral videos in internet history, and then became all of this. Not bad for $750 and some glue. If you are still here, if you have been here through all of it, through Kenny's immortality and the aliens and the censored episodes and the Colorado mountains and the 2 friends in a film class who found each other funny, then thank you. I mean that genuinely. The fact that you spend your time with me on this journey is something I do not take for granted. If any of this kept you company tonight, if any of it helped you rest, if any of it reached through whatever your day was like and offered something warm in the dark, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it keeps this channel alive and makes it possible for me to keep making things like this for you. Leave a comment telling me which layer surprised you the most, or which piece of this you had never heard before, or just let me know you were here. And rest now. The iceberg is not going anywhere. It will be here when you come back. All those layers, all that dark water, all that hidden depth, perfectly still and perfectly patient. Good night.